autopoiesis and allopoiesis. An autopoietic system is a self-producing system. So, think of a cell. It grows its own boundaries, its own structure. It's a self-producing system. An allopoietic system is a machine. You have to put something in one side, and then it'll come out the other side, and the structure itself has to be built. It never grows itself. It can change, but it's not changing its fundamental components. It's pieces. It has pieces that don't change, and they're separate pieces that you assemble. So like a car engine. Organisms require food too. So autopoiesis requires an intake, but the intake becomes the autopoietic system itself. Food becomes the body. Fuel doesn't become the car. Fuel passes through the car. Input, processing, output. The cognitive science that's based on computation and the computer metaphor thinks that the mind, or the brain, let's just forget about the mind if we don't even want to be metaphysical in any way. The brain thinks the brain is an allopoietic system. And it seems much more likely, based on what we know about the structure of the brain and how it's divided into these neurons. And each neuron is like a separate body, and it has its own sensory and motor operation going on. It has the dendrites and the axon terminals, and it's just like the model that we have of ourselves. We have sensory input on one end, and then we spit this motor output out the other. But they're all together working on this huge project that, maybe we'll call the mind, but forget the mind for a second. The computational model looks at the brain and says it's a computer. It's processing data in an input-output way. It's like a car passing fuel through it. And therefore, the organism's only motivational factor is survival. Just like the engine's only use of fuel is to burn it. There's nothing else going on. It's just an engine burning fuel. It's a brain crunching symbols. They don't know what the symbols mean. They just line up in the correct shapes, like gears. It's all about the shapes. It's about the form. There's no substance behind the form. There's no consciousness. There's no viewer. There's nobody inside. Nothing inside. It's all outside. It's all gears. It's all machine. That's allopoietic, and the brain is autopoietic. I don't think that's a strong claim. I think that's pretty obvious, or it's at least the best conclusion we could come to based on what we know about the neural structure of the brain itself and the composition of the body and the nervous system as a whole. It's an autopoietic system. So it has an identifiable boundary. It's inside my skull. There it is. And it does its work in there, even though the work metaphor that it's doing work is more of a factory metaphor, more of a mechanistic metaphor, more of an allopoietic metaphor. So it's not doing work. It's not processing inputs to spit out an output, because it's not really concerned with inputs. It doesn't get any inputs from outside. There is no outside. The self, the organism, defines its own world. And when we think this way, we have to get rid of this subject-object duality that we're used to thinking in, because that's all that is. It's a particular way of thinking about the world that doesn't necessarily line up to our actual experience of the world. But to realize that, we sort of have to get back to our experience. That's why the guys that came up with autopoiesis were phenomenologists, and one of them was a Buddhist. And that's because they really thought that science needs to get back into understanding, its own direct empirical experience. What's really there, objectively, is that you are an experiencing being. You're embodied. You can't get an objective view of anything. You're not a subject. You're not a noun. You're not an ego. What do you mean? Who are you talking about? Show me.